Hi, my name's Heather James and I'm a TTL scholar. I am an English teacher in FE in Birmingham, and currently most of my students are English language GCSE resit students. This is a qualification that my research focuses on, and it began with the question, to what degree do the unseen texts in the exam discriminate against and exclude the students that I teach? My students come from Birmingham's southern inner circle, areas like Small Heath, Tyseley, Sparkhill, Sparkbrook, and many come from families who came to Birmingham from Bangladesh and Pakistan and India after the havoc wreaked by colonialism on their homelands. Many of my students come from the Mangla Dam region of Kashmir, where their villages disappeared underwater. In 2018, a 16-year-old student wrote a story about some friends having a picnic. This student had lived in 3 different countries. She spoke Mirpuri, Arabic, Italian and English. I'd been encouraging students to write from their own experiences, not least because the exam scheme uses the word convincing, and so I always encourage students to write about something they're familiar with, something that they know well. And she'd chosen names for her characters in her story, Amelia and Toby. I queried this because I thought these were not the sorts of names that she would have come into contact with. They were not names that she would necessarily be familiar with in her life, which she confirmed was the case. But she explained that she would be using English names in the exam because she felt it would help her chances of getting a good grade. And it wasn't that she thought that the examiner would be deliberately prejudiced against her. It was that she wanted to produce a good piece of writing, and the examples that she'd been shown of good writing were all written for white middle-class audiences. Let me show you a complete picture of the writers that have been used by the exam board for the unseen text. Just looking at the writers here chosen by the exam board, it's clear to see that they don't represent the whole of the UK. They certainly don't represent the people of Birmingham, and they don't represent the students that I teach. The suitability of this qualification as a measure of language competency has rightly come under a lot of scrutiny. Its highly technical nature, the addition of 19th century texts, the devaluing of the speaking and listening element, and the emphasis on literature. But aside from those issues, this research began with a critique of the materials used for the exam and the practice materials that are provided by exam boards. These are heavily relied upon by teachers because the qualification is so technical and 100% written exam, half of which requires the students to analyse unseen texts. I'll try and put it into context. In 1977, the concept of cultural capital was coined by Pierre Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Passeron as a way to explain how power in society was transferred and social classes maintained. In 1993, Nick Peam called for a critique of the subject of English in schools as a means to diagnose the subject's complicity with modes of thinking and institutional practices that are based on social discrimination. In 2015, Victoria Ruth Johnson, an English teacher of 14 years who changed career to work within an awarding body for GCSE English, wrote in her PhD thesis rationale, "I have a concern with the way in which the assessment privileges particular social cultural practices and bodies of knowledge." In May 2019, Deborah Pearson, Head of Curriculum English for AQA, stated in her podcast, named De-icing with Death and Jane Eyre's Flamingos, that often the barrier to students isn't a case of being unable to decode the words on the page, but it comes from a lack of knowledge about or familiarity with the subject matter, and this positions students as either insiders or outsiders privy to that knowledge. She goes on, and so the theory of cultural capital suggests by equipping students with broad cultural knowledge and experience, we put them at an advantage in terms of them being able to engage with text in an exam context. She goes on to say further, we being teachers, can't compensate for a student's home or family life and the context they're in, and then explains how schools can use backward planning. In September 2019, the ASCL wrote in their final report, The Forgotten Third, that the qualification has a subjective feel to it in terms of the materials chosen. And they go on to say that in the assessment criteria, there is no mention of a grade 4 standard pass equating to competency in one's own language. So we can see that the term cultural capital was coined as a way to theorise how culture is used in society to maintain power dynamics, but now it's a common term that teachers certainly are fully aware of. A requirement embedded into the curriculum and assessment criteria for English language, and a recognised barrier to students. The forgotten third in the ASCL report refers to those students who get lower than a grade 4, which is a standard pass, each year, and this is fixed by the frequency distribution of the grades. My students belong to this third, and they arrive disillusioned with the education system, demotivated with the subject of English, and lacking in confidence. What they need is to rebuild their confidence, and the materials that we provide them with is a crucial part of this. Students come out of the exam and complain that they didn't understand the unseen text. And they have the expectation that this is going to happen again during the next exam. After the exam, they'll come out of the exam hall and ask for specific word meanings often. For example, one year it was, what is a yacht, a Y-A-C-H-T? Another year, a student asked me, what are skis, S-K-I-S? And for many people, many people can take for granted what yachts and skiing are, but it's not that my students, or it's not that the students that I teach are lacking in cultural awareness, it's just that their cultural awareness is not the same as the people choosing the materials for the exams, and therefore it's not valuable as cultural capital. For a qualification that employers believe measures language competency, cultural capital should not be a barrier. And it's time that we ask ourselves, who decides what makes it as cultural capital, what is more valuable as cultural capital, and how it's being used to prevent certain young people from specific economic and cultural backgrounds from moving forwards in their education and their careers. I want to prepare my students for the exam, for the unseen text, but the first step to doing this is to arm them with critical faculties that give them the confidence to recognise writing for different audiences. We need to re-engage students with the subject by ensuring that they encounter writing that reflects their lives and their experiences and validates them, making those connections so that they understand why they enjoy reading certain things and they don't enjoy reading others. This involves finding writers who can also show students that they should be telling their own stories and not someone else's. So I'll leave you with the titles of some books, several of which are brilliantly edited short story collections that I hope contain the writers who my students will be inspired by and continue to read long after they leave education. And the voice of a student reading from an essay that she wrote about the GCSE qualification.
Imagine an entirely different situation, a situation where thousands of students create thousands of different impressions of their lives. Each of them talks about what they are passionate about in any form. After all, each of us is different. Each time the examiner reads one student's work, he cannot wait to read the other's work. Wouldn't that be more interesting? Each of us having the right amount of time to write about the topic he loves, about which he wants to share with the world, we could create something marvelous. I like to believe that the form of the exam will change over the time, and that the way a student proves his or her skills will encourage free and deeper thinking and depend on the student themselves expressing their realities and issues. We live in a country where our voices count, and this one of our most important values, that the Department of Education should not take lightly.